Okay, what can we learn for these two little-known people in the Bible? We're going to talk about Naaman and Gehazi. So if you turn to 2 Kings 5, and we'll start in verse 1, and we'll pretty much just stay in 2 Kings 5. So in verse 1, now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. So Naaman is the top commander of the king's army, and the king feels God is with him. Since God is with Naaman, that is why he wins every battle. Naaman had to feel pretty good about that. I mean, the king, trusted him in this way. Now we'll read verses 2 through 5. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and brought back a captive, a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master was with the prophet who was in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." Verse 4, and Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel." Then the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed, and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. It is surprising that they listened to this captive girl. I mean, what was she, a teenager? Maybe in her early 20s? And she must have been very trusted, because her mistress accepted what she said as being valid. So look at verse 6. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, "Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy." And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes, and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." So he's thinking there's going to be trouble soon. Verse 8, so it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became furious, and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord, his God, and wave his hand over this place and heal leprosy." Verse 12, are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. Naaman seemed to have this attitude of, do you not know who I am? He seemed to think that there should have been a big parade and all the billboards should have said, "The great Naaman is coming to town." From UCG Bible Commentary, says, Naaman was a very powerful and successful commander of the Syrian army and the personal assistant to Ben-Hadad II, the king of Syria. He was, however, a leper. When the Syrians found out that Elisha could perform miracles, Ben-Hadad sent Naaman to Israel. Naaman arrived with an entourage at Elisha's house, expecting an official and pompous welcome, and that Elisha would come out and perform this spectacular healing right before his eyes. Elisha, however, told him, through a messenger to wash himself 7 times in the Jordan to be healed. Naaman became furious at this prescription to restore his health did not meet with his expectations. Receiving second-hand instructions to bathe in the silt-laden waters of the Jordan was offensive to him. Feeling humiliation and anger, he snorted out the names of Syrian rivers, which were cleaner and colder than the Jordan. Then in Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown's commentary on 5:12, you don't know exactly why Elisha would not meet with Naaman in person. In the long run, that decision certainly helped Naaman to see that it was God, not Elisha, who performed the healing. And that may have been a factor. Perhaps the reason also involved Naaman's disease, rendering him unclean, so that contact with Elisha would have made Elisha unclean, interfering with his ministry to others. And you can go to Numbers 5:1-4 for that. The command to wash in running water was in line with the law for those to be cleansed of leprosy by the priesthood, and that's Leviticus 14:8-9. With no Levitical priesthood in the northern kingdom, it seems that God's prophets there carried out certain priestly functions. Perhaps the washing in the Jordan was symbolic. After all, the Old Testament washings prefigured spiritual purification and baptism, and 7 times would denote completeness. Moreover, of all rivers, Elisha chose the Jordan, which would seem to be symbolic of entering the Promised Land, or at least a connection with it. And receiving God's blessings there, in that sense, it may have be that this Gentile had to be symbolically cleansed before partaking of God's promises to Israel, in this case for physical healing. It could also be that Elisha's seeming snub and comparably humiliating instructions were to humble Naaman, which is what I would assume, and test him on to whether he would obey instructions. We read now in verse 13. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done that? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Further comment on Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown. In any event, Naaman's servants encouraged him to follow Elisha's direction, and to his credit, he did it. When he did, his leprosy was healed, because health trials have such a profound effect on us, mentally as well as physically. God will often use these experiences to work with us spiritually. It appears he may have been doing this with Naaman. Now, if we look at verse 15, and he returned to the man of God, he and his aides, and came and stood before him, and he said, Indeed now, I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. But he said, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Verse 17, So Naaman said, Then if not, please let your servant be given 2 meal loads of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings or sacrifices to other gods, but to the Lord. Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand and bowed down the temple of Rimmon. When I bowed down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. Then he said to him, Go in peace. So he departed from him a short distance. And this is a more UCG commentary on these last verses. It says, What then are we to make of Naaman's thinking? Again, it may well revolve around the fact that his faith was not yet educated. We do see that he was very concerned about not offending God. And it's clear that his bowing in the temple of Rimmon would only be in compliance with his official duties. But he obviously could not yet have learned all of God's statutes regarding the avoidance and accoutrements of pagan religion. God teaches us true understanding gradually, not all at once. Christ told his disciples that he had to tell them so much, but they could not understand it then. And that was John 16:12. They would, however, understand later in that time, verse 13, indeed, it is not at all unusual for people new to God's truth today to believe that it is acceptable to participate in Christmas parties at work and the like. Naaman had been reasoning similarly regarding pagan temple services. Moreover, for someone in Naaman's position and society, totally avoiding any appearance of participation in the national religion would be a little bit more difficult than what we have in the freedom of the Western world today. Next, let's look at Gehazi and what we can learn from him. Starting in verse 20. But Gehazi, the servant of Elijah, the man of God, said, "Look, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian." And I wonder if he said that with disdain, like, he's from Syria. I mean, come on. He's not one of us. Why not receive from his hands what he brought? But as the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him. Verse 21, so Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from his chariot to meet him and said, "Is all well?" And he said, "All is well. My master has sent me, saying, Indeed, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the mountains of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments." So Naaman said, "Please take 2 talents. And he urged him and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and 2 changes of garments and handed them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of him. When he came to the citadel, he took them from their hand and stored them away in the house. Then he let the men go, and they departed. Naaman was willing to give more than Gehazi requested. You have to ask, could this change in stance affect Naaman's newly found trust in the God of Israel? This makes it like a capricious gods of the land who consistently change their demands on the people. Look at verse 25. Now he went in and stood before his master. Elijah said to him, "Where did you go, Gehazi?" And he said, "Your servant did not go anywhere." Then he said to him, "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from the chariot to meet you? It is time to receive money and receive clothing, olive groves and vineyards, sheep and oxen, and male and female servants." Verse 27, Therefore the leprosy of Naaman will cling to you and your descendants forever. And he went out from his presence leprous, as white as snow. Ben-Hadad, who had sent the best for his valued servant, it even included olive groves and vineyards. Gehazi's greed and perhaps contempt for this Syrian got the best of him, and he completely forgot that Elijah would be informed by God what was going on, which is better than security cameras. Since leprosy is still a problem in parts of the world, is there still descendants of Gehazi around? In 2 Kings 8, don't need to turn there, but you can read it later. We read where Gehazi once again, and this time his attitude seems to be different as he tells Ben-Hadad all the things God has done through Elisha. Apparently God saw that Gehazi had potential and just needed an attitude adjustment. In the end, Naaman was ready to trust in the true God, but a servant of Elisha, who had seen all the actions of God work through Elisha, did not really see the power of God. Maybe Gehazi got complacent, but Naaman knew no God he worshipped was capable of this healing. The biggest lesson of these verses is against becoming complacent, taking the truth of God for granted. It is a pearl of great price and needs to be the thing foremost in our minds at all times.